Hello and welcome back to Starmergeddon, the TLDR News weekly podcast. Today we've got a two-person special.
Oh yeah.
Me and Ben back again to talk about the life and times of Keir Starmer. Not quite today. We're actually going to be talking about the upcoming budget,
Yes.
which is now 2 weeks away.
Yeah,
I think.
30th of October, so yeah, roughly 2 weeks.
This is going to be the big sort of, probably the biggest moment of the early sort of part of the Premiership.
I feel like they've been sort of deliberately keeping things a bit vague and just saying wait for the budget.
Yeah,
This is like the big thing they've been building
We
up
finally
to.
get to see how Labour are going to deal with all of the problems that they have been talking about for a long time. So we're going to talk about the kind of challenges that Labour face, the solutions that we might see in the budget, or lack of solutions, possibly, depending on what happens. Maybe some sneaky ways Labour can raise money, whether they're going to meet their promises or not meet their promises about taxes, that kind of thing. But first of all, we've got an exciting announcement to make. If you are the proud owner of the original Too Long newspaper, which came out at the end of last year, and also the proud owner of the most recent edition of Too Long, the UK election special from earlier this year, you might be thinking, this doesn't look great on my shelf. One newspaper, one magazine is frustrating.
It is frustrating.
The spines don't line up like that. What can I do? Well, we have the answer for you in the form of the repurposed original Too Long newspaper in the form of the magazine, which should go really nicely as a little collectible to go alongside your future editions of Too Long. It's obviously the same content as last year's one, but it's the graphics have been slightly redesigned. There's a little extra bit at the end, sort of reflecting on what's changed. It's really nice, high quality print.
Yeah. It's nice if you've had the newspaper and you want to be able to keep reading it going forwards, or as you say, have the collection to be able to sort of like read through it and have something a bit nicer, a bit higher quality.
Yeah, and it should hopefully be a lot longer lasting than the newspaper, because the newspaper's a little bit more flimsy, obviously. So you can go to toolong.news, the link will be in the description, where you can buy that. We only have printed about 500, I think, of these, and I think already half of them have sold, and that's with pretty limited promotion. So if you do want them, get them as soon as possible. Get it. It's good. Anyway, the budget.
Yes.
Perhaps it would be best if we start by giving a bit of context about the sort of challenge that this budget is aiming to address, because we know Labour have been talking about fiscal black holes and these kinds of big, scary sounding things. Do you want to explain a little bit about where we're at leading up to this budget?
So Labour always knew that coming to power, the fiscal situation wouldn't be ideal. That was clear in their election campaign. It's been clear over the last year as they've been sort of trying to sell themselves as the next party of government, that when they get in, there are difficult decisions to be made. They're not just going to come in and cut tax. So it's been no surprise to anyone that they're not at this point promising tax cuts. Now, the big change though was when they first came into government. Rachel Reeves claimed that she found a £22 billion fiscal black hole, which just means the government is spending more than it's getting back by roughly £22 billion. So that needs to be closed. For a few different reasons, not least because one of the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves is claiming that she wants to abide by is that the budget must move back into balance, which basically means she has to close the black hole. So that has complicated factors slightly, because prior to discovering the black hole, Rachel Reeves ruled out a load of different mechanisms that chancellors would normally use to try and close black holes. So a big part of that would be just increasing taxes. If you increase taxes, your revenues go up, fiscal black hole closes. The issue is that she effectively, both before the election, before the campaign period, and in the campaign period for the election, promised that she wouldn't raise income tax, wouldn't raise national insurance, wouldn't raise VAT, and wouldn't raise corporation tax, which together account for about 75 to 80% of the government's tax receipts, which
It's
obviously massive.
Yeah.
So the rest, so the government...
They've given themselves very little room for manoeuvre.
Each year the government collects about £1 trillion in taxes. Now 100 billion, 150 billion-ish, is what you've sort of got left once you've ruled those tax out, and a few other smaller ones that you can't raise for some other, like, either political reasons or because they're too small or because they're already too high. So to raise £22 billion on top of like £150 million taxes is going to be really difficult. Obviously, there are other ways that she can do this. You know, there's messing with the state pension, messing with pension contributions. That's a possibility. Student loans are another possibility. There's obviously some other tax within those 150 billion that we can obviously go into. So there are a few different ways, but she's effectively tied her hands quite significantly. Yeah. And she's also, as I'm sure we'll get onto, and as I've already alluded to in this, aside from making those promises, she's also sticking to these fiscal rules, which are also tying her hands a little bit.
And the other way, obviously, you can sort of, not raise revenue, but, you know, close that gap is by cutting spending.
Yes.
But they have pledged not to bring back austerity,
yes.
which is sort of a vague promise not to cut spending, but we'll see how that actually plays out.
It's not well defined.
No.
You know, because they've... You could technically make the claim that the fuel allowance is for public spending, I suppose, but it's just, significant public spending cuts, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think also one thing to point out, and we have actually discussed this in previous episodes of the podcast, but this £22 billion black hole wasn't unknown and didn't just sort of appear out of nowhere when they took office. There had been warnings from various institutions about this situation before the election, but we've talked about that before and probably not worth going over again. So as we get closer to the budget, as happens with every budget, you start to get this drip of things in the press like, oh, Labour could do this or they might do this, and you get the sense that it's sort of testing the waters, seeing what the reaction will be to things. One that has sort of generated the most discussion so far, I think it was earlier this week, was Labour effectively refusing to rule out increasing national insurance contributions paid by employers, so not employees, but employers. This is something that seems pretty likely that it will happen, I think, given what's been said so far. This has caused a bit of a political feud, because obviously Labour promised not to increase national insurance, and now we get to this tricky, very sort of like into the fine print, like, is it actually breaking a promise or not? So I thought it might be interesting to sort of have that debate between ourselves. We might end up agreeing, but we'll see. Where do you stand on this?
So I think it's tricky, right? I think the exact phrasing was that, or at least in the manifesto, was something along the lines of, we won't raise taxes on working people. That means not increasing national insurance. Now, there was no qualification on that in my mind, that fell under the category of taxes on working people. No national insurance rises. That wasn't no national insurance rises that are levied on working people, which is obviously employees. So from my understanding is that on a technicality, I would say that is a small break of that promise. I think that the way she phrased it certainly implied that national insurance wouldn't be going up at all. I think it does keep within the spirit, though, of what she was promising, which is that working people, it won't be me and you that will be stuck with this national insurance rise, it'll be our employer. And that will be the same for everybody else. So working people aren't being affected. So I suppose it sticks within the spirit of what she's promising.
The argument obviously is that while our own, as employees, our own national insurance contributions won't go up, the impact of the employer's contributions going up means, you know, maybe workers' pay rises are less likely going forward, or, you know, the employer sort of passes down that increased contribution in some other way.
But I would push back ever so slightly on that, because that is the sort of argument they always use about this private school levying tax on private schools, that cost will be passed down to parents. And there were other things that they cut spending to, and they raised that money in other places than simply putting private school fees up. Obviously, I think they went up a little bit, and there's evidence that they have gone up. But there were other ways that they've got that capital to account for that shortfall. And I think that would be the same in terms of companies. You know, I understand someone's got to pay, and you know, employers aren't just gonna shoulder the burden. But I don't think the entire rise is going to fall entirely on the employers. There will be other ways of sorting that.
Yeah, I think for me, I generally agree. Like, it is breaking the promise based on the words that are in the manifesto. But I don't really understand why, if they always thought this might be an option to raise money, why they didn't just, during the election campaign, phrase it better.
Yes,
phrase it more clearly.
So
say, we won't raise taxes on working people, which means we won't raise employees' national insurance contributions.
I suppose that the issue there is that you then imply that employers' national insurance is going up.
Obviously that's a whole separate political fight.
Yeah, and you'd rather have that political fight after the campaign.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's probably why they did it.
Yeah.
Like that ambiguity gives them some defence in the campaign, and they only have to make that clearer as we're getting closer to the budget. Yeah. And even if there is a backlash, that'll die down within the months after the budget.
But the whole sort of sneaky wordplay of it all sort of adds to the speculation that Labour might do some more slightly sneaky things in the budget.
Well, it's interesting because I know that we obviously we've just discussed national insurance on employers. Another thing that I think is worth discussing, that is a really interesting way, is pension contributions. So currently pension contributions, this is obviously quite complicated and we're not tax people, but in essence, the contributions that you make to your pension aren't usually taxed. There are definitely limits to that, but on the whole, the premise is that when it's going in, it's not taxed, it's tax coming out. And you get a rebate on that. Now, we are employed. Employers contribute part of our pension contribution, employees contribute as well. Now, there is talk that Reeves might introduce national insurance on either employees or employers' pension contributions. And that would raise, if it's employers, it could raise about £16 billion, which I think is another thing that is being discussed. And that could be lumped in here. It could be one or the other. But it seems, again, it's all of these arguments all the points we made so far would also apply to this as well. Yeah. But I think this is another interesting one of them it's another sneaky way of trying to get a little bit of money out. And I suppose that even if it does pass down to people, it's much better doing that than employees, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. If you're taking money out of pension contributions, that's, I suppose, we're working people as we're paying the pension, but when you receive that pension, you're not a working person, so maybe that sort of just about meets that promise, but I don't know, I'm not so sure. Yeah. But that's an interesting one. I think perhaps the biggest thing they could do, and this has again been subject to a lot of speculation, is effectively rewriting the rules that they have pledged to follow. And this is something we actually made a video about the other day, so it might be worth checking that out as well if you've got time. So Labour have committed to following these fiscal rules, and these aren't rules. I think it's important to note that these aren't like laws of nature. These aren't rules that they have to follow to the dot. They are things that they have sort of put upon themselves as sort of guidelines that they want to stay within. So it is entirely possible for them to rewrite those rules, and these kind of rules that the Treasury does follow have been changed in the past. So it's it wouldn't be unprecedented to do. Do you want to, sorry, I'm going to throw this over to you. Do you want to explain how they might rewrite these rules and what impact that might actually have?
Yes, there's two main fiscal rules. The first is that in the current budget, costs are met by revenues such as tax. Obviously, this, as I've already explained, interacts with the fiscal black hole. So the second rule is that debt must be falling as a share of the economy by the 5th year of the economic forecast. Now, what that means is that in order to close the fiscal black hole, you can't do excessive borrowing because that would violate the second fiscal rule. So what you could do, and there are some suggestions here, that instead of having it as the second rule as debt as a share of the economy, you would change that up slightly and have it as public sector net worth. So what that means is that you're looking at the total value of the UK economy, looking at assets versus your debts and making sure that that's increasing. So a very simple way of doing that is it's measured as a total value of what the government owns minus what it owes.
So by doing that, presumably, if then the government invested a lot of money into something, the money they've invested doesn't send the debt as a percentage of GDP spiraling, because what they've invested in, that new asset, whatever it is, the value of that is included in the calculation of the economy.
The Institute for Public Policy Research, which is quite an influential think tank, I think, and is very influential with the Labour Party particularly, has suggested that a good way of looking at this would be looking at it as a company. Assuming that the Chancellor is looking at this as if she's running a company, and that they're looking not merely at a company's indebtedness, but also at its assets and its growth strategy. So it's a way of accounting for the fact that, yes, we're borrowing more money, but it's in order to grow the economy. So this very much fits in with some other policies that Reeves and the Labour government is pushing forward with, which is Great British Energy and the National Wealth Fund. So, very much trying to, in both of those situations, it's trying to leverage private capital by putting the government's money up first. But again, that putting government's money up first will increase debt. It seems to be a really good way of still meeting the fiscal rules, still abiding by the fiscal rules, but also allowing to borrow money to invest in the economy, going forwards. So that would be a really clever little change. Yeah. That would really give her some leeway. As we said at the start, Reeves has really tied her hands in a lot of different ways. So there needs to be some give at some point. And raising taxes just won't cut it for this £22 billion fiscal black hole. Because again, I know we didn't really get into this then, but there are other things that people are discussing about raising. So for example, there was some discussion about capital gains tax being raised, but in order to get a significant amount of money from it, you'd have to increase capital gains by a significant amount, which would discourage people from selling assets, which would actually mean that the tax receipts go down, not up. So it's so difficult for her to be able to just use taxes alone in order to get this money back. Because if you mess with them too much, there are weird second-order effects which will, really make it very difficult to get any tax receipts at all. And capital gains is such a good example of that. So tax alone probably won't cut it. There were some bigger ones that you might be able to mess around with. Obviously, we've already discussed pensions. I think ultimately she will have to go with something. She will have to go with changing the definition of some of the fiscal rules to go about this.
So these are the kind of things that might give them the space to pull a rabbit out of the hat, as I think is sometimes said at the budget. Off some kind of generally positive thing that they can say, look, you weren't expecting this.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the talk pre-budget has been pretty doom and gloom, and we've discussed this before on the podcast. And Labour, they haven't shied away from saying, it might be painful. So we'll see if they manage to give themselves space and what they do with that space.
Yes, exactly.
But obviously at this point it's speculation, and we'll see if these sort of drips of information coming through the press actually turn out to be true, and what Labour do end up doing in the budget. I'm sure we'll discuss. If you have any thoughts on the sort of potential sneaky things that Labour could do, comment them down below. Let us know what you think they might do, what you hope they do at the budget, and we'll come back in, I guess, 2 or so weeks.
Be interesting to see what they do.
Yeah, because this, like we said at the start, this really sort of sets the trajectory of the next few years.
Yeah.
Big moment. We'll finish on that note, I think. And obviously, do go to toolong.news to check out our reissue magazine version of the newspaper that we published at the end of last year. I think we'll leave it there.
Yeah.
We'll be back next week to discuss something else, and then the week after that will be budget week.
Yes.
Stick around, subscribe, like, comment, all those good things. You're probably used to it by now. Thank you, Ben, for joining me.
No worries, thank you.
And thank you guys for watching.